I'm Megan Roberts, agricultural economist at Compeer Financial, and I'm joined today by Perry Aasness, Vice President of Legislative Affairs, also with Compeer Financial, and we are here to talk about a DC update and a little bit of an outlook on what might or might not happen in 2026. Welcome to Compeer's Ag Edge, brought to you by Compeer Financial. In each episode, we break down complex agricultural economics, policy dynamics, and farm business topics into conversations that make sense for your operation. We're here to help you stay informed and confident about the trends and decisions affecting your agricultural business. We're recording here on January 21st, 2026, and there is, as typical, a lot going on in DC. And one of those things that is on the docket, maybe not top of the docket, but is on the docket, would be a Farm Bill 2.0. Perry, can you refresh us on where we're at with that process, why it's not the top of the docket, and what might happen next?
Yeah, thanks, Megan. So we are in the third year of an extension of the 2018 Farm Bill. And so as Congress has gone back into session in 2026, they've got a lot on their plate, some issues they've got to deal with before a farm bill, including passing a full budget for this fiscal year. But we are cautiously optimistic that they can get to a true farm bill, or I guess Farm Bill 2.0, we're calling it right now. Notwithstanding the fact that they did pass a bulk of the farm bill spending in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act in 2025, there's still a lot yet to do to include what has typically been a farm bill with various titles. And so while they have a few things to do before then, we are picking up some encouraging signs that at least on the House side, they're going to be close to introducing a farm bill text and marking it up.
Awesome. So in your mind, to summarize that, the number one priority right now in Congress is not agricultural related because they're trying to get some of those mini buses, mini spending packages done to keep the government open, correct?
Yes, if we recall correctly, Congress reopened the government, of course, back in November. What they did was pass a continuing resolution to fund the federal government. Those titles, those appropriation bills that were not included in that continuing resolution expire January 30th. And so as they've come back after the first of the year, they've been working to try to get the rest of those appropriation bills wrapped up. The House at this point is close to getting the final four appropriation bills done, wrapped up, and passed before the end of this week. The Senate is out of session this week. And so the House, if they do their work this week, they'll send to the Senate, but the House will be out next week. And so Congress seems to operate on deadlines, and we have one coming up January 30th, and hopefully, of course, that they can get the final funding for the fiscal year done at that time. We're in a new year now, and they'll have to start working on the fiscal year 27 appropriations process shortly. But that's the most immediate deadline right now that they're working to try to get wrapped up here by January 30th.
And one of those agencies that is not impacted by that January 30th deadline would be USDA. They have already received their funding. So this would be a partial shutdown if it happened, but hopefully it does not.
Yeah, you're right. Exactly. The USDA funding was included in the bill that reopened the government back in November. But I think both sides, we are in an election year. I think both sides took a hit from the government shutdown, the 43-day shutdown that ended in November. So hopefully they can get this wrapped up here by the end of the month.
So let's say that does get wrapped up. Let's say we move through some of the other legislative priorities and Farm Bill 2.0 does become a hotter topic. It's become something that is moving through Congress. Can you share with us a little bit about that process and what we might expect if it does become a legislative priority issue in spring or summer 2026?
Sure. It does appear at this point that the House is going to move first. The House Ag Committee, G.T. Thompson is the current chair. We're hearing that his staff are close to wrapping up the text of what could be introduced as the Farm Bill text in the House. Timing of that is yet to be determined. Again, the continuing resolution issue needs to get resolved, but by all accounts, the chair is intent on getting a bill introduced, marked up in committee. The biggest challenge then after that is to make sure that he's got floor time from his leadership in the House, because I think the process would be is to have a quick markup, pass out of committee, get floor time, and try to get the votes to get hopefully a bipartisan bill, Farm Bill 2.0, passed off the House floor. And then we move over to the Senate and see how their process goes from there.
So if we are not able to get that done spring, summer, what's happening in fall? I think there's a kind of major event happening in fall. So that's maybe share a little bit more about that and why that's not a likely time frame. But then what becomes the timeline for Farm Bill 2.0 if we are post-fall 2026?
Yeah, in most cases, pieces of legislation that may have some controversy, which I don't think this is, but generally speaking, you don't want to have these sort of bills moving forward in an election year just because of the politics. The agenda in Congress gets much more narrower. There's a lot more at stake. And quite honestly, if you look at the congressional calendar, even though as we sit here in January, December of 2026 seems like a long way away. When you look at the amount of days they have to get things done, they're going to go on recess as they traditionally do in August and then come back in September to get some sort of funding mechanism legislation passed by the end of the fiscal year. And then they're running for election. And so what that means is that the time frame to get pieces of legislation passed, like a farm bill, kind of has to happen in the first half of this year. And so the fact that the House is getting prepared to move forward, I think, is encouraging. And I think for a lot of us in agriculture, a lot of us that are working on trying to get a farm bill passed, we just need to see something get started. We had that back in 2024 in May. Again, the House took the lead. But since that time, there's been a lot of talk. But, one thing after the other, different priorities have come up. And so we do expect, assuming that Congress gets a full funding bill passed by January 30th, there's also already talk about a second reconciliation bill. And so we know there'll be some other competing priorities. But at the same time, members of Congress are hearing from their constituents that, there's a lot of economic challenges in agriculture. We have a farm bill that, again, was passed in 2018, and here we are in 2026. A lot has changed since then. So we're hoping and we believe there'll be some momentum there to try to get something done that modernizes our farm programs through a farm bill.
So when it comes to potential text, we have had potential text in the past couple years. You just mentioned the May 2024 version. That has lapsed, not relevant to today. But when might we see a potential text out of perhaps the House?
It would appear or seem that we're very close. We're probably within weeks and not months. Again, I think what's holding this up right now is trying to get this appropriation package passed. Again, by all accounts, the chair of the Ag Committee is ready to release his text. And again, I think the cadence would be to have a markup shortly after, hopefully get some bipartisan support. And again, the big thing is getting a farm bill off the House floor has always taken some measure of bipartisanship. There's very narrow majorities in the House right now. The Republicans have, and so there's not a lot of wiggle room they have. And so hopefully the bill that Chair Thompson marks up will include some priorities on the Democrat side of the aisle as well, which we think it will, and that'll hopefully help pave the way to get a bipartisan bill passed off the House floor.
So one of the arguments or maybe one of the ways that we might see some movement on Farm Bill 2.0 or moving legislation is the economic situation, certainly challenging row crop economics at this moment. Is that something that you're also hearing from the Hill, that sort of challenging dynamics that Congress people are hearing from their constituents is driving some of the momentum at the moment?
Yeah, I think it's clear that members of Congress are hearing from constituents, and in this case, farm constituents, that given the current economic challenges, some sort of additional ad hoc assistance is needed to again, be that bridge, if you will, to hopefully better economic times. USDA, of course, announced their Farmer Bridge Assistance Package late last year. Farmers able to sign up for that. Those payments, we're told, will likely be coming out of USDA by the end of February. But even after that, certainly there's, I think, by and large, a recognition that that's a good thing for agriculture, but it's not perfect. One area in particular being specialty crop growers, who in that Farmer Bridge Assistance Package have about $1 billion out of the $12 billion appropriated for that. And when you talk about specialty crops, that's a very diverse group of crops. And so I think there's members of Congress, particularly in the ag leadership, that recognize that if for no other reason, they probably need to supplement this FBA package with some additional assistance for specialty crops, and then also for the broader economic challenges facing farmers. And so the issue, I think, is unclear. I guess the good news on that standpoint is the fact that both sides of the aisle are talking about some sort of additional ad hoc assistance. So last week in the Senate, the chair of the Senate Agriculture Committee, John Bozeman, introduced a ad hoc assistance package for agriculture along with Senator John Hoeven from North Dakota. A little short on details, other than they're looking at perhaps up to $15 billion in ad hoc assistance, as well as some other things and normally would be included in the Farm Bill, such as raising the loan limits for FSA direct and guaranteed programs. On the House side, the ranking member of the House Agriculture Committee, Angie Craig, introduced a package of relief for agriculture, as well as some potential changes to the nutrition title changes that were included in reconciliation. That was kind of her marker, I guess, if you will, in terms of recognizing the need for additional assistance. And then also on the House side, the chair, G.T. Thompson, has talked about a recognition that they need to put something together, and probably in that $10 to $15 billion range, it seems like they're looking at right now. So I guess the point is, the good news is that there's, I think, a bipartisan recognition that some additional assistance needs to be looked at for agriculture, what that looks like, the dollar amount, ultimately what's included, and the legislative vehicle for that are yet to be determined.
Yeah, so a lot just covered there. We've got the certainty that we do have with the Farmer Bridge Assistance Program. That is announced. I think the last time you and I were sitting down and chatting on this podcast, we knew the grand total. We had some speculation about what the amounts might be, that they'd probably be really similar to last year's Emergency Commodity Assistance Program, but they did not announce them until in the press release. It said that it would be before the end of the year, and those did come out on December 31st, I believe. I'll just mention two of those payment rates that are probably most relevant to this area would be corn and soybeans. And so for corn, that Farmer Bridge Assistance payment rate per acre is $44.36. Soybeans is $30.88 per acre. And those are really similar to ECAP. Where we do see some differences in that Farmer Bridge Assistance Program versus last year's Emergency Commodity Assistance Program is in some of the row crops that are produced in the southern states, and they're having a much more challenging economic situation. And then also specialty crops are experiencing some challenges, but we are still awaiting that $1 billion, and that also includes then sugar producers as well. So that is known, but we're waiting on that $1 billion. The very unknown would be some of those programs that you just mentioned from the House and the Senate that may still be coming on top of that as ad hoc. And then we also have this conversation about Farm Bill 2.0. So a lot going on in terms of what the congressional response might be. But it is being driven in many parts by some of the crop side of the agricultural economy. And maybe this would be a good time to talk a little bit more about corn and soybean dynamics. We did just have a January World Agricultural Supply and Demand Estimate report that came out. January reports tend to have some news in them. And this one was a report that really fit that mold of creating a little bit of news. So for corn, there was a pre-USDA WASDE report supposition by the market, by traders, that maybe there would be a decline in yield. And the market seemed to maybe build some of that into the pre-report pricing, the pre-report trading. Then, when that WASDE was released and we didn't have a yield decline, we ended up with a very slight but nonetheless important yield increase for corn and some additional corn harvested acres. We really saw some, I was going to say dramatic. I don't want to say dramatic because that seems like too big of a word, but there was certainly a market reaction. There was some weakening of prices. The WASDE actually increased the estimated corn price from $4 up to $4.10 per bushel. But when it came to market trading, there was some price declines just as the market and farmers reacted to the fact that we hit over 17 billion bushels of production in corn. That's record breaking. And just seeing that number, I think, was a little bit eye-opening, a little bit shocking for the market. And so we've got this really large supply in corn, but there were some nice positives in there, really good demand for corn exports. We're actually experiencing some price positives from our corn export market. That's a bit in contrast to some of the numbers on the soybean side, or we saw a further decline of export estimates for soybeans. There was already a reduction in estimated exports back in November, and then they reduced those even further in the January WASDE by another 60 million bushels. They've lowered the projected soybean price from the high of $10.50 estimate for 25-26 soybeans. It's now back lower. It's at $10.20. Very, very tiny changes to some of the yield projections. Yield projection actually stayed flat, but I should say on the harvested acres, there was just this slight uptick, and that did increase our overall production. But it was really an export-related dynamic for soybeans in the January WASDE, and it was really a production-related dynamic on the corn side. But all in all, was seen as, unfortunately, a bit of a bearish report for row crops, and then also a little bit of a challenging situation for even some of the livestock. If we're looking at dairy, we've seen quite a bit of price decline in dairy as we've finished out 2025. Thankfully, they were coming into 2025 with a really good position, but now as we're leaving 2025, entering 2026, a little bit of a more challenging dairy situation. Maybe some positives still, one could argue, on that pork and beef side, but that would be, to tie this back to our original conversation, Perry, those challenging agricultural economic dynamics. If there was the momentum for Congress, that would be it.
Yeah, I think one way to look at it, obviously the Farmer Bridge Assistance payments that were announced, that came from USDA. Mm-hmm. And I think many in Congress were thankful to see some assistance, but I think, as you mentioned, some of these reports, WASDE having some of the economic data to point out some of the challenges in agriculture economically, and big crops here, and perhaps not as robust demand or export demand for these crops in many cases. I think it just provides that additional impetus for Congress to supplement or add to what USDA has already provided through the Farmer Bridge Assistance.
Yeah, absolutely. So because we are talking about demand, I think that might be a good segue to tariffs and to some potential decisions that might be coming very soon from the Supreme Court. Perry, do you want to share a little bit more about that dynamic, a non-legislative dynamic, but it's the Supreme Court really ruling on who has the authority? Is it Congress or is it the executive branch?
Yeah, certainly no sector has been riding this wave of tariffs as agriculture has over the past year. And, I think ultimately, if this leads to stronger trade agreements for agriculture, that would be a positive. But we're sitting in this moment right now where it's really unclear how long these tariffs will continue, what the authority is of a president to impose tariffs unilaterally, what the role of Congress is in this. So a lot at stake on this, and while it's an interesting constitutionality question about the authorities of a president and executive branch versus the legislative branch, a lot at stake for agriculture. So getting to the point, the Trump tariffs, the tariffs that were imposed back in April of 2025 have been challenged. That challenge made it to the Supreme Court. The president used a piece of legislation passed in the 1970s for the authority to impose these tariffs. That is the question before the Supreme Court right now, whether or not the use of tariffs through that statute, it's called IEEPA. I won't even go into the acronym or the word of all of it, but the point is that is under consideration right now by the Supreme Court. And that has the potential, one way or the other, to have implications in terms of our trade policy as a country and the tariff policy of the Trump administration going forward. They heard oral arguments on that case back in November. I think everybody in agriculture and probably other sectors as well, for that matter, are waiting to see what the Supreme Court does with that. Do they overturn the president's authority? Do they allow for the constitutionality of it? We were hoping that would be something announced sooner than later, even as soon as this week. If it is, it's only got a couple more days yet where the Supreme Court could announce it. Otherwise, we're probably looking at a few weeks down the road. But that's certainly one issue to follow that's going to have implications for agriculture and the ag economy. And then the second issue I'll just mention to keep an eye on is the fact that the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Free Trade Agreement, which was negotiated during the first Trump administration, is actually subject to a review this year. And that's something that's part of the statutory authority that allowed for that agreement. So this is not something being done unilaterally by the Trump administration. All three countries are taking a look at that now, including the United States, as a way to gauge whether or not they want to continue with the agreement, make some reforms to it, pull out altogether. And obviously, we know how important Mexico and Canada are for U.S. agriculture exports. And Mexico is number one, Canada is number two. I think most in agriculture would say, by and large, it's been a good agreement for U.S. agriculture, notwithstanding some issues perhaps with Canada and some dairy policy and some issues related to specialty crop growers. And so the U.S. Trade Representative's Office has started the process to hear from agriculture stakeholders, including agriculture, back in December. And by and large, the message was, this is a good agreement. Don't throw it out. But the point being is that the U.S. will be looking at this current agreement, I should say the U.S. government, the Trump administration, and it's something to follow because we've been hearing different signals. I do not expect that the Trump administration is just simply going to say, it's good, we're supportive, let's keep going. And that's not necessarily new or bad. That may be the case with Canada and Mexico as well. The issue is how far are we going to go, and if in fact the U.S. would decide to pull out of that or make some substantial changes. Obviously, that has a lot of implications for agriculture and our ag economy.
Yeah, absolutely. Just a review of those things. Something that is really key about that Supreme Court case is it is focused on IEEPA tariffs, and there are actually quite a lot of tariffs, less so impacting the agricultural tit for tat of tariffs, but in other industry sectors that are not IEEPA. So those are under different authority, and so it's all complicated and complex, but this would definitely have a really big impact on those tariffs that were under that particular authority. And then when it comes to USMCA, something that I often like to remind folks is just that when it came to the last year of tariffs, some of the reason why the impacts to agriculture were not as large or pronounced was because of USMCA, and most USMCA covered items, including agricultural products, were not always from the first go round, but eventually, as we negotiated through some of these tariffs, they were eventually exempted. And that enabled us to keep trade going with our number one and two agricultural trade partner. So really important stuff, and it will be interesting to see how these things play out. Some might play out very soon in the next couple of days, and some it is a longer term thing that we'll have to watch for the upcoming months. So with that, I think we've hit most of the big agricultural topics. I will say that the other thing that is on the horizon that I'll be watching is next week we do have a Federal Reserve Open Market Committee meeting. They are at this point not predicted to make changes at it, but that can always change. We have to wait until tomorrow to see what inflation data comes in at. I think after that report is released, and that's a report that was delayed a long time due to the government shutdown. But when that's released tomorrow, I think that there will be some additional insight as to what the Fed is going to do. But for now, it's looking like minimal, if not no changes at next week's meeting. That's what's on my agenda. Perry, anything else to add as we wrap up for this episode?
Well, just to say that everything we talked about today, obviously,
it's dynamic.
It's dynamic. And as we talked briefly, we're in a midterm election year with a lot at stake with both sides of the political aisle. And so as much as we all want certainty, there's going to be a number of, I think, twists and curves along the way. But hopefully we get some policies in place that support agriculture. Hopefully we kind of move forward with some of this tariff stuff that allows trade to continue to flow. Export markets continue to expand for U.S. agriculture, but we'll just have to wait and see.
We'll have to wait and see. So we'll be back in a few short weeks, actually, for our February episode. We will hopefully have something new to talk about. There'll be progress somewhere. We just don't know exactly what. We're also going to talk a little bit about crop insurance on that episode because there have been some changes from the One Big Beautiful Bill Act to discuss. So come back to our next episode. We'll definitely be talking more about DC and what's going on with ag policy. Thank you for listening to Compeer's Ag Edge. You can follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. For more agricultural finance insights and resources, visit Compeer.com. That's COMPEER.com. Until next time.